So I'm Karen. I'm from the International Biogeography Society, and thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Jack, for agreeing to host this. Jack is a geography professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the former director of the Center for Climatic Research. His research includes novel climates and ecosystems, abrupt change and causes and consequences of past species extinctions, and the last deglaciation as a model system for understanding the 21st century climate change. He is a chair of the Executive Working Group for the Neotoma Paleoecology database, which serves the global change community by providing a high-quality, curated repository for paleoecological and paleoenvironmental data. So Jack, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Karen, and thanks to all of IBS for inviting me. This looks like a fantastic week, and thanks all for joining up. All right, and also in terms of kind of giving due credit where it's certainly due, this is going to be a review and synthesis of a series of paleoecological, paleofire, paleoclimate records from across the eastern U.S. And a number of people have been involved in the gathering and analysis and interpretation of these records. And lots of names shown there. And particularly, want to highlight David Fastovich and Ali Jensen. David's a current PhD student in my group, and Ali just completed her master's thesis. And parts 2 and parts 3 are really going to be presenting work that they have put together that I'm going to kind of showcase on behalf of the group here. And this work has been supported by NSF, and the data that some of the data we draw on does come from Neotoma. We certainly encourage folks to use Neotoma data. All right, so 3 parts, kind of setting up the stage model system for climate-driven ecological dynamics, and then looking more closely at the spatial fingerprint of deglacial temperature changes, and then specifically looking at the widespread loss of spruce forests from the area in the climatic and fire drivers. Okay, so to set up the kind of conceptual framework here, this is a figure that Jacqueline Gill developed when she was a PhD student here that I've always really liked in terms of thinking about what controls past vegetation dynamics in Eastern North America. We look at the bottom and think about vegetation, community composition, ecosystem structure and function. There's a whole set of complex interacting controls of changes in climate, changes in fire, loss of megafauna, arrival of humans should be added in there, and how they are all interacting with each other to lead to these large effects upon past ecosystems. And this sketch here, the large arrows show the factors we think are really important. The thinner arrows show factors maybe we think are maybe a little bit less important or secondary. And then dash versus solid means how well do we have an understanding of these factors? How well studied are they? Solid, better studied, dash, less well studied. So that's the big sweep. And then in terms of specific questions, part 2 is actually have a little bit more of a paleoclimatic emphasis about understanding the magnitude and pattern of past temperature changes during the Younger Dryas, because the Younger Dryas is a very important interval of abrupt climate changes during the last deglaciation. It's a really important time period for looking at how species respond to past abrupt cooling and warming. And so we're going to look at that more closely. What were the patterns of warming and cooling across Eastern North America? This is David's work. And then part 3, we'll look at this intersection of changing climates and changing fire regimes as we lose these spruce forests from across this domain here, just like we're worried about losing conifer forests and ecosystem type transitions in the Western US. What role did fire play in these systems during the end of the last deglaciation? Okay, and to kind of further set the stage, a lot of my work tries to work at this intersection between what we know from the past and how can we apply that knowledge to what is happening around us and in the future. And this is a figure that Kevin Burke prepared a couple of years ago, and I think just kind of sets the stage well, where we are looking at the last 60 million years of global temperature history here, with this kind of zoomed in time scale from tens of millions of years to millions of years to hundreds of thousands of years to the last 20,000 years to the 20th and off into the future centuries. And then this is changes in temperature, global mean temperature, warmer than present, colder than present, all relative to present. And so we see this long-term Cenozoic cooling. We see the Pliocene and then the Pleistocene ice ages. We see the last ice age. We see the last deglaciation and the warming. We see some pretty big reversals along the way. And then we have the quote unquote stable Holocene, and then we start to see 21st century change emerge. So lots of things happening and lots of different kind of model systems for looking at how species responded to past warm periods like the Eocene, past abrupt changes like the end of the Younger Dryas or the onset of the bowling Alarod, past periods of hydroclimate variability like the Holocene, and so forth. So there's a very fruitful set of terrain here to explore if you're trying to understand how species adapt ecologically and evolutionarily to climate and environmental change. This talk will focus specifically, and a lot of the work we've done in my lab is focused very closely on the last ice age to the current interglacial, 20,000 years ago to about 8,000 years ago, and looking at the temperature changes and ecosystem dynamics during that time period. And going back for decades, people have collected large networks of fossil pollen records, and we're looking at a couple previous efforts here. Margaret Davis was really the first to pioneer looking at many individual sites. And if you actually look at her first maps there, every place is these are these isopols showing the migration of pine northward according to her early mapping. There's for about 15 years ago, some animated maps we made that shows these patterns in some more detail, but the same basic story that as climates change, species expand their ranges. You go from kind of high abundances down here and expanding northward and westward as temperatures rise and so forth. We have this idea of novel ecosystems, that there's this reshuffling of communities and different taxa, moving in different directions at different rates. And as a result, we have these novel or no analog mixtures. The areas of high red here indicate communities that are compositionally unlike any modern communities. They are distinct. They are the same species, more or less. They're recognizably modern species, but they are found in different mixtures than we'd find on a modern landscape. So they would look unusual to an ecologist of today. We can see that there are these abrupt changes that as climate changes at varying rates, we can see some abrupt ecosystem changes. Now we're looking at a couple pollen diagrams from some of our work, relatively recent records in the eastern US from 19,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago at this site, and 17,500 to 9,000 years ago. And these are sort of classic pollen diagrams where we're showing lots of spruce crash. Not a lot of spruce, stays low, a bit of a recovery, and then crashing again. Most people working in eastern US would interpret this as a temperature signal. Cold, lots of spruce, warming, the bowling Alarod warming, spruce declines, Younger Dryas cooling, spruce recovers a bit, and then Holocene warming again, and that's it for spruce in the area. There's more to it than just temperature, fire, megafauna, and so forth, but that is sort of first order understanding of describing these patterns. And again, these are pretty abrupt collapses according to pollen records in terms of going from very high abundances of spruce pollen, and by implication spruce trees, to low abundances of pollen and potentially trees in a time scale of decades, to centuries. Okay, and again, we're going to focus on this more, really thinking, there's one of the kind of new buzzwords as we think about climate change and all the kind of massive fires out west, is preparing ourselves for sort of ecosystem type transitions. It's not just individual species coming and going anymore. We're preparing for wholesale conversions of forests to savannas, to grasslands as fire regimes change and temperatures get hotter and so forth. We're really seeing some of that starting to play out right now. And again, this is a model system for that kind of behavior. We go from these sort of mappings of lots of spruce pollen and by implication lots of spruce trees across the central US and eastern US, and then the die out of spruce widely across this domain as temperatures rise and spruce expands northward. So this is mapping at kind of the genus level, but it really does represent a larger scale ecosystem transition from boreal forests, coniferous forests, to the temperate forests and grasslands of this area today. Okay, so again, lots going on and well documented, and there's lots of interacting processes. And today I'm going to focus mostly on the climate drivers and the fire drivers, while acknowledging there's lots of things that we're not focusing on today that are also important. One of the interesting paradoxes is that Eastern North America is very well studied from a paleoecological perspective. We have hundreds of lakes and bogs that have been analyzed for pollen and so forth, but it's kind of a gap when it comes to paleoclimatic records. This is a big synthesis from Shakin et al. 2012 Nature, where they kind of came up with a deglacial, if you look at the upper right there, we're looking at changes in CO2 and changes in temperature in the northern and southern hemispheres. So you're kind of doing this kind of global assessment of as CO2 rises, what happens to temperature in the hemispheres. This is mostly a marine synthesis and ice core synthesis. And so it understates what's actually available on land, but it's still true that there's a real scarcity of non-pollen paleoclimatic records from Eastern North America in this area that's been kind of a cornerstone of the biogeographic side of these past climate-driven ecological dynamics. Also, when it comes to the fire side of things, in the US at least, there has been a ton of money and effort spent on looking at fire dynamics in the Western US because things burn there all the time. The US Forest Service and other management agencies are very concerned about fire behavior, as we can see in the news right now, and in the intensification of fire regimes. Whereas in the East, the mesec forests in the East don't burn that much in the historic record. They did burn in the prehistoric record, pre-settlement record, from the European colonization perspective. And so there is less attention paid with some notable examples to the fire histories of these areas, and some work in southern New England by Wyatt Oswald been adding some important new records. This is from a 2009 synthesis, so we could add new dots to the map here. But the general point is true that we have much more knowledge about the fire history of the Western US and Western North America than for Eastern North America. Okay, so this is kind of setting up where this is a case where data syntheses can only take you so far. What we really need are new records. And so this is some campaigns led by Steve Jackson and myself, and some of the people you saw at the beginning, Jacqueline Gill, Jim Russell, and others involved at key stages of this, in which the blue dots and gray dots represent prior sites from the Neotoma Paleoecology database. The orange circles and red circles represent target sites. This is from a grant proposal, so we didn't get every site here, but we got a lot of them. And so this represents some of our target sites, with one campaign targeting kind of the north central US, from Indiana through Ohio to just a corner of Pennsylvania, and another campaign led by Steve targeting the southeastern US, recording classic sites in Missouri and Georgia and South Carolina and Florida. And then with kind of the multi-proxy approach of pollen for past vegetation dynamics, sediment to charcoal for past fire histories, branched GDGT, I'm not even gonna try the whole spelled out name, as a biomarker indicator of past temperature variations, and then coprophylla spores as indicators of the Pleistocene declines in megafauna. And I'm not going to talk about that part today because Angie Parati, who's a current postdoc in the group, is working on synthesizing the spore data right now. So a set of sites in the north central US and then the southeastern US, some of the lake names and site names there. So then, and to contextualize this, in this day and age, those of us who kind of work this interface, we want to go get new records, but always now in the context of what's already been collected, right? There's so much effort involved, decades, a century now of effort of palynologists, that really what we should be seeking to do is looking for gaps in the record, looking for key uncertainties in the record, and where can our new records that we collect best augment the existing records already out there. So this is a quick pitch for the Neotoma Paleoecology database as this open community curated database in which we encourage all to add their data in. We encourage people to become stewards, to curate the data and make sure the data is high value and the latest age models. Now we have in Cal 20, so we've got to do another generation of age model rebuilding, and all the rest of that keeps this data at the forefront of the current standards and expectations. Our records are going to Neotoma. We help assist others with that all the time. And currently, Neotoma has been in an ongoing growth stage. So we now have over 7 million individual observations, over 37,000 individual data sets, pollen, radiocarbon, diatoms, et cetera. We have over 18,000 sites. So it's a classic example where the more you add to it, the more valuable it gets. And so we really encourage people to join in and help out. Okay, so now to kind of zoom in on the Younger Dryas, A well-known phenomenon of intense interest to paleoclimatologists and paleoecologists and anybody interested in tipping points in the Earth system. And so a couple of the classic features of it. In Greenland, we're looking here from about 22,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. You see it's cold, it gets really warm quickly, that's the Bowling Allerod warming. It kind of stays warm, and then it gets really cold quickly and stays cold, and then gets really warm again. That's the Younger Dryas. That's kind of the iconic Greenland temperature, signal, strongest in Greenland, North Atlantic, manifested in various ways across the Northern Hemisphere. In the southern, and the other side of the world, in the Antarctica, when it's cold in Greenland, it's warming in Antarctica. So there's this classic bipolar seesaw that the two hemispheres, the two poles are going in opposite directions during the Younger Dryas. Cold here, warming here. Oops, losing my pointer for a second. Warming here, cold here. And so the proposed mechanism is changes in ocean heat transport with the Atlantic as this key conveyor of heat energy from the Southern Ocean to the Northern Ocean. And when that conveyor is operating at full speed, the Northern Hemisphere gets warm, gets that heat energy, and when it slows down, the Southern Hemisphere keeps that energy. This is kind of an arcane indicator of this strength of the circulation. It's this ratio of these two radioactive isotopes, actinium to thorium, but it's basically interpreted as a measure of circulation speed. And what we see here is that there's a slowdown of that circulation during the Younger Dryas, consistent with this sort of bipolar seesaw strength of heat transport hypothesis. Okay, so that's the classic bipolar seesaw that is used to explain this millennial-scale variability, and the idea that this is a tipping point. It can sort of abruptly flip on and flip off, where sometimes it's on, the seesaw tips towards the north, and the north gets warm. Sometimes it's off, and the seesaw tips to the south, and the south gets warm, all basically invoking the strength of northward heat transport from the Southern Ocean to the North Atlantic through this on-off seesaw tilting back and forth transport mechanism. Okay, so under that kind of simple model, it's kind of a hemispheric model. One hemisphere or the other hemisphere is warm or cold during the Younger Dryas. So we want to look at that more closely because there's been some signals for a while that doesn't quite work for all of Eastern North America. So this is a synthesis of some new temperature profiles from brGDGT, this organic biomarker indicator of past temperatures. We are going to use the pollen here as a paleoclimatic proxy, something I don't always do because I tend to look more at the ecological dynamics. But here we're going to focus on what kind of temperature inferences can we extract from the fact that we had spruce trees in Tennessee and northern Georgia and so forth. So we're going to look at about 55 records total between pollen records and these new brGDGT records. And we're going to kind of look at three regions: the Northeast, the North Central, and the Southeast. And this is where we're getting into David's work, to be clear. And so at some initial sites, we did some first pass comparisons. If we take a record from Ohio and we core it and we do the pollen analysis and the GDGT analyses, we do a standard transfer function for the pollen data to infer past temperatures from the pollen compositions. And then we look at the GDGT inferences of temperatures from this biomarker, geochemical signal. Do they agree or not agree? And this is one of these kind of relationships where we say, well, they mostly agree. They agree with the uncertainty that goes into these things. We're looking at the last, 17 to 9,000 years ago. Temperature anomalies here. The blue are a couple different. It's a couple different calibrations of the same GDGT data. They have their own kind of modern calibration data sets. The red represents the pollen inferences at silver from the pollen data at silver. The black with gray represents a stack of 5 pollen sites and their temperature inferences. And so our interpretation is that the Weisser's calibration does not agree very well with the pollen data, but the Peter-C calibration does, and that to a first order, the GDGTs and the pollen are telling us the same thing about deglacial temperature changes. When Ben Watson did this work first, he came up with a temperature range of variation, as you see here in this plot, on the order of 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, so that's pretty big. When David Fasovich reran these analyses with some new and improved techniques that the organic geochemists have been developing, he came up with about half the magnitude, about a 6 degree range and variation over this time period. Okay, so now we kind of look across these sites. In the Northeast, we see the classic Younger Dryas cooling. In this area, all we had are pollen records. We didn't do any GDGT work over here. So this is just classic pollen-based paleoclimatology, and this area is right next to the North Atlantic. So as expected, it shows a pretty clear and consistent Younger Dryas signal. This is stacked across all the sites in the area. All those sites have like radiocarbon uncertainties. They have proxy uncertainties, and so this is an aggregate signal across those several dozen records from those areas. The North Central North America also shows a cooling signal. 2 brGDGT records from Bonnet and Silver, the stack of pollen records from the area, all show a Younger Dryas cooling. Maybe not as strong, maybe not as clear as for the Northeast, but it's there. We see what we interpret as a Younger Dryas cooling. We get now to the southeastern US, and things start to look different down there. Basically, out of all the records we show, we had 3 GDGT records from White Pond, South Carolina, Sheelar Lake, northern Florida, Cupola Pond, Missouri, and then a stack of the pollen-based reconstruction from the area. All the pollen records, 2 out of the 3 GDGT records, show a consistent warming during the Younger Dryas and no sign of a reversal in that area. So it really appears as if the southeastern US is either showing no Younger Dryas reversal, or maybe even a slight peak in temperatures, small, during the Younger Dryas. And so there's really a sense that the southeast is not seeing the Younger Dryas the way that the north central and northeast are. When we look at sea surface temperature records from the area, this is work that David did, kind of looking through the literature. Some of the nearby marine sea surface temperature records also don't show much of a Younger Dryas signal, maybe a little bit of one of there. There's a new record from off the coast of Florida that shows intensified storminess, maybe more intense or more frequent hurricane activities. So there's also some evidence from the marine record that this region of the southeast and adjacent maritime areas is a bit warm or not, at least not cooling that much during the Younger Dryas. When we look at this in kind of a spatial perspective, the left plot shows temperature differences between the early Holocene and Younger Dryas as kind of 2 comparative time periods. The blue boxes are places where it is cooler during the Younger Dryas than during the early Holocene. And the red boxes are where it's warmer during the Younger Dryas than during the early Holocene. The triangles are the branch GDGT data. The filled cells, grid cells, are summaries of the pollen data, with the numbers indicating the number of sites per grid cell being aggregated into that 2-degree grid cell. So we can start to see the spatial fingerprints of northern cooling, southern either no change or slight warming during the Younger Dryas. And then a principal component analysis right there kind of reinforces that. The first principal component of these time series, explaining 58% of the data, the variance in data, shows us kind of north to south, with the south, the Florida specifically, looking quite different from the rest of the US. So, okay, so what? From a climatic perspective, this is important because it starts to rule out sort of the simplest models of these millennial-scale variability, which is only the bipolar seesaw at play. We're starting because that wouldn't predict why the southeast is getting warmer. It also rules out simple models of propagation in which you sort of say, well, the North Atlantic gets cold, the westerlies pick that kind of low heat signal up, transport that around the northern hemisphere. So that's why the northern hemisphere would all, under that simple model, you sort of see the whole northern hemisphere get cold during the Younger Dryas. And we're not seeing that, at least in this region. And David, kind of works through, this is, I think at this point, a working model, and he's diving more deeply right now into the Earth system models to look into this. But kind of a working model is that as we have this kind of cooling over the North Atlantic, that starts to intensify the pressure differentials here. That starts to lead to shifts in the jet stream. That starts to lead to a little bit more advection coming in from the south. And then the other thing that happens is that you start to get intensified intertropical convergence zones and intensified circulation of this subtropical cell. And that starts to lead to more heat transport with this subtropical cell advection, bringing more heat up here, which then these atmospheric changes in atmospheric circulation can bring in over the southeast. So a working model for why is it they can get cooling up here and warming down here may be tied to a strengthening of the ITCZs and a strengthening of the subtropical cells. And this is kind of the cartoon version, and David is diving right now into persistent models to look at this more closely. You know, this is a biogeographic audience. So I just did a whole section on paleoclimatology, but of course this really matters for us, right? Because we are interested in the processes that control the distribution and diversity of life on Earth. And there's a growing recognition that past climate variability, quaternary stability and velocity and all the rest of that is probably a really important control in why some areas are biodiverse than others, why some areas have more endemism than others. And in the Southeast, in the US, the Southeast is our hot spot of biodiversity. We have high diversity and endemism of mammals and birds and plants and amphibians and reptiles. And so it may be that this kind of anti-phasing or muting of the strong North Atlantic millennial scale variability may be a key reason why this area has higher diversity than other parts of the US. You know, more work to be done here too. This is simply noting at this point that there's a correlational pattern between the high biodiversity today and that kind of anti-phasing and muted variability we see in the past. So one kind of idea then is that we're kind of exploring further is this idea that the southeast may act as this kind of important fulcrum that if you kind of look at ranges of, you know, this is sort of slope of temperature by latitude for different time periods, and that there's kind of a fulcrum here at about 30 degrees north, give or take, where north of that fulcrum there are these big temperature swings, and at the fulcrum and south there are a few temperature swings. And so an interesting area for biogeography may be to kind of look for these millennial scale patterns of variability, look for the fulcrums between these kind of dipoles of, you know, opposite reactions as key areas of biodiversity and preservation and climate stability. Okay, and I promised kind of a third part here. I recognize I'm going about 27 minutes here, so I'll do about 10 or 15 minutes here to kind of close this out. So, of course, it's not just climate, it's not just past changes in temperature, there's lots of interacting processes. And so in the US and everywhere to some degree, we are really worried about changes in fire regime leading to these massive ecosystem transitions. Australia, of course, has had their own share of tragedies there recently. And there's been a lot of, you know, current attention, and there's lots of projections ahead towards if you increase the frequency or increase the severity of fires, at some point the forest doesn't come back anymore, and now you shift to something different after that. And again, in terms of model systems and places to kind of look at what's happened in the past, you know, there's a whole bunch of these snapshots here. You know, this is spruce, pine, elm, and just focusing on this key area of eastern US, we go from having lots of spruce forests and high spruce abundances to those basically dying out. So we have a natural example of that classic trailing edge dynamic that as climates change, species move, and that can mean that there's a leading edge expansion and there's a trailing edge extirpation, and that's what we see happening in this area. So the question then becomes, what's the driver of extirpation in this region? What we can see, again, from the pollen records, is that this isn't usually some kind of general ramp down where you just go from high to low slowly. What we see is that there's lots of complexity and some pretty quick transitions along the way. These are some of the different records just kind of grabbed from the various original data papers. Abrupt declines here in recovery, you know, abrupt decline here at the second decline, the second spruce peak in its decline, abrupt losses here, and you know, maybe more gradual with some stair steps along the way. And so we can see that these transitions can be pretty quick at these individual sites. So here, same basic approach, and now bringing charcoal in the mix, and then doing change point analysis to detect the change points in the pollen data, and then char analysis as a stats package to detect the fire events in the charcoal data. So one thing we do see is that there is an association, I'm going to kind of talk about this quickly, is that we do see an association between declining spruce and rising temperatures based upon the branch GDGT records we have at those two sites where we have both the pollen records and the branch GDGTs. So we do see that first order correlation of spruce declines and temperature rises. If you actually do like an auto-corrected statistical time series correlation, It's a pretty weak relationship as it turns out, pretty low, significant p-values, low R². So it's not the most significant relationship you'd ever see statistically, but it's there. And I think, qualitatively, we certainly see this correlation between declining spruce and rising temperature. When we look more closely at what's happening at, an individual site, so here's Silver Lake, and where we don't have the temperature up, we're just looking at the fire records. So now we're looking at, here's that spruce decline and a little bit of a rise. And then based upon the BCP statistical analyses, here are the change points. These are places where the model thinks there is a likelihood of a significant change in the record. So one is flagged here, one is flagged here, one is flagged here. It's also kind of catching something as a possibility there. So these are the change points according to BCP. And then down here is the charcoal record. And so this is where we're counting, the undergrads or students in the lab are counting the individual flecks of charcoal. Some intervals don't have much charcoal. Some intervals have a lot of charcoal. And the standard interpretation is that there's two components here. There's kind of smoothly varying background component that represents kind of slow changes in the amount of charcoal washing in from the watershed into the lake. And then there's the peaky, flashy fire events in which a fire event happens in the watershed, generating a lot of charcoal that goes to the lake all at once. And so char analysis then is peak detection software, that any red dot here is a detected peak that is interpreted as one or more closely spaced fire events. So we can start to look at when do the fire events happen and when do the vegetation change points happen. And what we start to see is a pretty good correlation, and a significant one, between rates of charcoal accumulation, fire frequencies, and rates of community turnover at the community level and at the sort of the taxa level at these sites. We're starting to see at Silver Lake, there seems to be evidence that intensification and periods of frequent fires are driving these abrupt ecosystem transitions. At 3 of the 5 sites we looked at, Stotzel-Leis, Silver Lake, and Triangle Lake Bog, they all show qualitatively the similar pattern, that we can line up these abrupt change points with fire events. We can look at the statistical relationship between fire frequencies and rates of community change. We see a statistical relationship. So at these sites, we think there is evidence for fire accelerating and driving some of these community changes. At 2 of our sites, Appleman and Bonnet Lake, it's less clear that we do see these spruce declines. We do see identifiable change point events, but they're not as clearly associated with fire events. Like here, for example, here's a big step down in fire, not showing a linkage at this site. Sorry, step down in spruce, not showing a linkage to fire at that site here, and no statistical relationship when we did the stats test. So, what's the takeaway here? So here we think the takeaway is, a couple of different points. One is that I think there is evidence, at least some of these sites, that fire really is accelerating these ecosystem type conversions, that you can take this long-term progressive temperature change and drive these abrupt ecosystem conversions by intensifying, one or more closely spaced fires can drive these abrupt changes. At the same time, we don't see that at every site. At some of our sites, it looks to be not as closely tied in. There may be other factors at play. And so this suggests that this isn't necessary for ecosystem conversions. You can still have climate change, progressive temperature changes, have an ecosystem convert. It just may be accelerated by having a high fire activity locally. Another point to be made here is that these are the 5 sites, Appleman, Stotzel, Silver, Bonnet, Triangle, kind of across this Indiana to Ohio area here. And, this is certainly not a perfectly homogeneous region. There's important differences in glacial history, moraines, soil texture and nutrient capacity, local topography and so forth. But at the same time, it's much more of a homogeneous region than, say, the Western US is, with a very steep slope and aspects, very big changes in temperature and moisture depending on where you are on the mountainside, fire breaks, and all the rest of that. And so even in this fairly homogeneous region, we see some very distinct site level responses, which of course suggests that you would expect to see more of that, even more so, of course, in the Western US today. So a good sort of takeaway and contextualizing of the changes happening now. I mentioned at the outset that we are also, of course, interested in past megafaunal vegetation dynamics. This kind of follows on from Jack and Gill's really kind of groundbreaking work in the area. And so we have, some work by Yue Wang. It's a modeling study that's back in review right now with World Ecology Biogeography, looking at some of the spatial factors contributing to the habitat losses for woolly mammoths. And then Angie Prodi is currently working on the spore data from all these sites and kind of coming up with a synthesis of the timing and patterns of the Pleistocene megafauna based upon what we see in the spore records, comparing it to various available fossil bone records and so forth. So that is kind of in the works, and hopefully we all see each other in IBS, Vancouver or wherever. We'll be able to show some of that work coming soon. And just again, this is super labor-intensive work. Lots of people have been involved in all these different years of gathering sites and working up records and writing up papers and so forth. So this is very much a acknowledgement to lots of people whose work I'm sharing here. And thanks to all. It's been fun, and it's been fun to share it with this audience. And so I will move now to looking at the chat window and taking questions. Thank you. Okay, so at this point, Karen, do you read or do I read?
So far, there are, so I'm just going to let everybody know how to ask questions if they weren't here for the beginning. You can either ask a question by typing in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand as an attendee, and we will let you ask your question live. And we'll just give everybody a moment to kind of figure that out. But if you have any questions about anything, there's also the chat box on a technical thing.
I see an open question from Christian about how can human use of fire accelerate or modulate ecosystem transitions. I mean, of course, it has a huge effect, especially the closer we get to today. Lots of people, Sandra Nogas included, looking at this very closely. And I think what you can really see is that when humans move into an area, you start to see often as a first signal is increased frequency of fires. And then that often does correlate to changes in vegetation. And then maybe at a later stage, as you start to have more intense cultivation and high density settlements, then you start to see more fire suppression as the next thing kind of happening. And of course, in the Western US, we've had 100 years of fire suppression. And so now we have this challenge of building up fuel load and a changing heating, drying climate. So it's hard to summarize, but certainly there are places in the early record, especially when we see intensification of fire regime leading ecosystem transitions or ecosystem changes at least. Now more recently this suppression factor. Let me look. I'm going back to Tyler.
Yeah, I'm checking the chat as well. Sorry, I've just realized that I have to scroll down in the chat versus the Q&A.
Curious about how the pace of changes in the past was similar or different than the pace of changes we are observing now. It's a great question, and there's been some nice review papers on that. I've written some, and there's a really good one in Science that just came out by Damien Fordham, Fordham et al., which is a nice overview of what can we learn from the past when it comes to conservation biology. And they do a good review of some of the rate of change literature. A short version is that if you kind of look at the global rates of temperature change, what we're seeing now or projected to see is, it's hard to find any equivalent in the geological record. If you look at regional rates of change, then some of the changes we've seen in the North Atlantic and adjacent to the North Atlantic are fast and arguably faster than the rates of change. The Greenland ice cores, if interpreted literally, are 10 degrees temperature change in a time scale of a few years to a decade or so. So very fast regional scale temperature changes. And that's one of the reasons why the Younger Dryas is so interesting, because we can actually look at rates of temperature change that are equivalent regionally or faster regionally than we might expect over the coming decades. And then you can start to look at hydroclimate variability and mega droughts and things like that if you want to think about the effects of changing hydroclimate variability on past ecosystems.
So I've just unmuted Dan, who had a question. I just bumped him over because I know him, and I've unmuted him.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Dan.
Hey, Jack. Thanks for the great talk. I was really interested to see those abrupt transitions timed with the charcoal peaks in the eastern records. And I was wondering, I didn't quite have time to digest everything that you were showing on those slides, but I was wondering about the taxa changes that were happening with the fire peaks, and in perspective of what the adaptations are for fire of the species involved with those
Yeah,
changes.
it's a good question. And it's interesting. I mean, fire ecology is something I'm kind of catching up on to some degree. I know you've worked on this a lot. You know, I didn't show it, but in the paper that goes with this, which is, you know, it's actually been accepted now, it's going to come out in Journal of Ecology. We show some of the other taxa and how they're changing as these spruce declines are happening. And one of the things I didn't go into is that at some of the sites, as spruce dies out, it's mostly replaced by pine, probably mostly the northern pines. And at some of the other sites, as spruce dies out, it's replaced by sort of that no analog hardwood mixture of ashes and elms and hornbeam, hot hornbeam. And you know, when it comes to those hardwoods, particularly, I don't think of those as fire adapted taxa. And yet it seems to be that at some of these sites, the change in fire regime is accelerating that spruce, what I would call kind of mesic hardwood replacement happening there. So to me, that's a little surprising, but we certainly need to look at that more closely.
Great, thanks.
Jack, I have a question. That was a great talk. And when I was looking at your diagrams, and links quite well with Dan's question, is like, it looks like all these changes, it happens to a certain type, this abrupt change, it happened to a certain type of trees. Have you looked at if there is any kind of big trait in common of all these taxa that they are responding abruptly to, for instance, a Younger Dryas?
Yeah, you know, for this paper in the presentation, we really focused on spruce as kind of the taxa to focus on. This was kind of the dominant conifer in the area, and it's a really good example of an area where what was a dominant species goes away. So the talk focused on that. In terms of the other taxa, you know, I mean, the classic, you know, I would say there's sort of a couple simple, you know, in this area, the classic transitions are spruce goes away, replaced by northern pines and cool temperate pines. And then after that, oak comes in, sort of a spruce to pine to oak as the most common types transition. And then the other transition is spruce, these you know, no analog hardwoods, back to spruce, back to hardwoods, but then oak hardwoods. And so there's kind of two different hardwood communities that come in. You remember there's that high spruce low, high spruce out. When that first low happens, these no analog hardwoods come in. When spruce goes away forever or long term, that's mostly oak coming in at that point. So there's two different hardwood forests that are coming in this area, interspersing with spruce. So that, again, that rising temperatures is probably, you know, oak may not have been the major player, say between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, but by 10,000 years ago, it is a major player in the area. And then, of course, oak savannas, we have those kind of classic Holocene oak fire forests. That would be something we're much more familiar with than, say, the oak savannas of southwestern Wisconsin and so forth. Yeah. And again, those no analog ecosystems of, say, 13,000 to 11,000 years ago with the hardwoods, but not so much of the oaks, that's still kind of different for us.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
So Jack, there's a question from Will. I'm gonna unmute him. Oh.
Thanks for the talk, Professor Williams. I found your points about how the biodiversity in the southeastern United States could be correlated with the recent climate variability interesting. And I was wondering if this is a pattern that's seen in other biodiversity hotspots around the world.
Yeah, there's been some really nice papers on that. And as an aside, Will's taking my paleoecology class right now. So this is a little bit of I didn't plug this question, but I can follow up with you more afterwards. But yeah, there's been some really nice papers looking at kind of, the velocity and magnitude of late Quaternary, last 20 to 100,000 years of climate variability, and then correlating that with hotspots of biodiversity. And there seems to be, certainly at the global scale, these relationships between climate variability. Areas of high climate variability have low biodiversity and low endemism, and vice versa. And now, now we kind of see the global scale patterns. The key thing to do is to start to zoom into some of these regions and look more closely at what's driving that climate variability, what aspects of climate variability are species most sensitive to, which species are most sensitive, and then other factors like dispersal limitations and so forth. So yeah, it's a pretty active field right now, and I can point to some more papers.
Thank you.
So I think, unless I've missed anything, that's the, oh, wait, there's one from Christian. Great talk. Do you think that there are really fire-adapted taxa? I mean, these could be traits, traits that suddenly work well under a novel selective regime.
Yeah, it's probably a continuum. My first order way of thinking about it, like there's some taxa that very clearly are fire adapted. They have evolved under high fire regimes, and they have evolutionary adaptations that specifically expect a high fire environment. So the classic example would be like serotiny, where a cone won't open and release its seeds until it's under a high temperature for a fire, and then it releases those seeds, and it's done so at a moment in which everything else has been burned off, and so those seeds can establish under a high light environment. So clearly, some species are evolutionarily fire adapted. Other species, the classic example might be American beech, which has a very thin bark to it. Doesn't take much of a fire to kill a beech tree. And so that is it on the other end of the spectrum, where it's very fire sensitive, and it's sort of a classic late successional climax species that doesn't do well under high fire environments, but is very good at competing for light under low light, shady conditions at the other end of the spectrum. And then, but there may be other taxa that are maybe more opportunistic, and maybe whether you're fire adapted or not may just depend on your relative advantage compared to your neighbors. And so in this late glacial era, there may be no single species that's a pure fire specialist or not, but they're all kind of competing with each other under these changing fire environments.
And moving over to the Q&A box, there is a question from Susana Velasquez Franco. How to differentiate between non-analog vegetation communities and novel ecosystems from the paleo record?
Well, I'm teaching a graduate seminar right now that Will's in, and we're going to do that midway through. But there's standard approaches that people have done for that, in which basically what you do is that you have a reference population of, say, pollen assemblages, pollen samples from let's say all the plant communities of North America, and we have a reference database now well over 4,000 samples that have been collected from various modern sediments all across the continent, and there's other modern databases in other parts of the world. And then you take your fossil pollen assemblage from, say, a lake core that was from 15,000 years ago, and you then do an analysis that's called dissimilarity analysis, community dissimilarity analysis, in which you say, is the composition of this fossil assemblage similar or dissimilar to all the modern assemblages that are out there? And it can either be 0, meaning it's perfectly the same, they're identical to each other, to more and more dissimilar, like a distance measure. And so what we can see is that those late glacial, those areas of high red on those maps that I showed early, they are all consistently very dissimilar to any modern pollen assemblages anywhere in North America today. And so the ecological interpretation is that they represent mixtures of species found in the past, lots of spruce, lots of ash, not much pine, and so forth, that you cannot find those counterparts in the North American landscapes today.
So I think that's everybody. Last chance to ask questions, but otherwise, thank you very much, Jack. It's been great to have you as a speaker. And for those who have already attended events, I think the next one is a Journal of Biogeography kind of open Ask the Editors kind of event happening this afternoon in about 2 hours. Maybe later, I'd have to check, I don't know. And then one in Australia. So I encourage you to attend those, but thanks, Jack. Great to have you, and thanks everybody for attending.
Thanks everybody.
Sorry about the lawnmower in the background.
Bye all.